or the post-industrial workforce, right? Okay, so today is going to be about Ike completely. All right, we're going to be all about Ike. And yesterday we talked about a host of things in the 50s, but today we want to look at what Eisenhower's agenda was called. You guys need study guides? So dynamic conservatism. I want to tell you right off the bat, that's an oxymoron. All right. By nature, conservatives are not very active. That's their goal, is to be, well, less active, in terms of politics. But Ike was one of the reasons why I like Ike so much is he was a mixed kind of administrator. In other words, he wasn't a doctrinaire or ideologue conservative. So he said, in terms of America, be liberal in terms of humans, like in the way you treat people. So, take care of health, make sure they're healthier, and make sure that their lives are, more comfortable, so to speak. If you go back to the preamble, this would be the more perfect union for people to have peace and calm. So I wanted America to be middle class, basically, middle of the road. And so he was more liberal in that respect, like TR, but more conservative with people's money. Okay, and that's where people like I am. I am a liberal when it comes to people's liberty, right? But I am a conservative when it comes to other people's money. Like, we shouldn't be spending other people's money until it's an absolute essential, right? So it's a taxing thing. So that's kind of what Ike was about. However, he hoped to slow military spending down, and he did. He actually reduced military spending a little bit, not a lot, but it still made up 10% of our entire GNP during his presidency. So by no means does he reduce the military on a large number. He didn't trust standing army. So he's actually going to reduce the size of the U.S. armed military personnel, so the number of men and women in uniform. But under Ike, we're going to see a massive buildup of nuclear weapons. So, and that costs a lot of money, but it doesn't really go down much. He will give up federal control over some oil, and most notably, he'll not support the Tennessee Valley Authority, which still existed. So he's opposed to the TVA. And so he didn't like what he considered creeping socialism. But there were many things within Ike's comfort that were not what he considered creeping socialism. So it's kind of interesting to me. Now, before we get into his other policies, I thought we should look at his domestic policies concerning minorities. So during you guys remember the Bracero program? Does that name ring a bell? So the Bracero program were legal guest worker immigrants to the United States. So try to think of these as like a legalized visa for Americans to allow Mexicans into our country for the purpose of work. Well, once the Bracero program started, guess who else came to America? Illegal immigrants, like people who weren't here on the visa, right? And so he is going to use the U.S. Armed Forces, right? So that's, we think about President Trump using military funding to build a wall. He's going to use the Army to arrest anyone, and it's not a positive moment in its history, but nonetheless, this happens, to arrest anyone who is Mexican looking. Now, this term, wetback, is an insult. It's a pejorative. You don't call a Hispanic person or Mexican person this anymore. But at the time, that was kind of common. So this is known in history as Operation Wetback. And what they did is they rounded up 1 million, and they called everybody who was Hispanic, basically Mexican. Kind of like us today around here, it seems, And they deported all these people, and some of them were Americans, American citizens. So this is the first time in the 20th century that the issue of illegal immigration becomes a topic. And it was mostly in California and Arizona, that area, southern New Mexico and Texas area, the border area. And so you kind of have a fast forward 60 years later, and we kind of have a redux of this, right? So they're trying, and by the way, Mexico worked with the United States on this because Mexico liked the Bracero program. This was money coming back into Mexico from the United States, right? But having all these illegal immigrants was not something that either Mexico or the United States wanted to do. So be familiar with this, the mass deportation of Hispanics who were, quote, Mexican looking. And then the other problem I consider, which will have serious impact on Native Americans, is what his administration does with Indians. So if you remember the Indian New Deal, the Indian Reorganization Act, that had allowed Native Americans to kind of restore their tribal identities, right? Well, under President Eisenhower, the policy had the terrible name of termination. So this is a sort of return to the Dawes Severalty Act. I laugh because that's like, crazy sounding now. All right. And so it wanted Native Americans to leave the reservation and to move to cities. They call it the Indian Relocation Act. Okay. So you should be aware of this under Ike. The goal is not trying to make a mixed kind of Native American and American, is to get rid of the tribal identity again altogether. So Native Americans are going to leave the reservation. No more tribes identified. Okay. And the government will start leasing out territory in the reservation, naturally. And this is going to produce a modern protest movement that you should write down. And that is the American Indian Movement, or AIM. And I'll talk about AIM again when we get into the 70s. But AIM is going to occupy Alcatraz as a protest, an act of occupation, civil disobedience. And then later they're going to occupy the Wounded Knee battlefield. Remember the Battle of Wounded Knee when the Sioux were killed off? And so they're going to occupy these things that are government. Alcatraz and Wounded Knee are government installations, and they occupy them as a sign of protest, like they refuse to leave. So out of this protest of the Eisenhower termination policy, you'll have what's called the American Indian Movement, which is a kind of more militant version of Native American civil rights defense. Okay, and I'd be familiar with that. Sometimes this is a period when you had Black Power on the rise, so they call this Red Power. The Native Americans. Okay. Now, I mentioned that Eisenhower, he was liberal, and obviously not those two policies, but in many ways, this is a great quote from Ike. Look at what he says. Should any party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment, or labor laws and farm programs, you would not hear of that party again. There is a tiny splinter group, of course, that believes you can do this. Their number is negligible, and they are stupid. All right, that's a great quote. So here is a Republican moderate saying what is here to stay. Social Security. Social Security, particularly. And in fact, it gets expanded under Eisenhower. This will prove to still be the most popular program in American history. So he's saying these popular things that FDR created, that the American people like, you shouldn't try to get rid of. Because there are American people like these, And I think that's a sign of good leadership, is to recognize, at least in the 50s, what programs are working, what programs do the American people support, and let's not ruffle any feathers, And by the way, Ike is very famous for, during his presidency, spending a lot of time golfing. His critics criticize him as the golfer in chief, and there was a tree. You guys know what the Augusta National Country Club is, home of the Masters? The Masters golf tournament? You never heard of that? I know. Well, Eisenhower liked to play golf at Augusta. It's a lily white country club, but it was a beautiful country club. And I forget which hole it was on. I can look it up just as quick as I talk. But at Augusta, there was a big tree, right? And it sat on the, it's been cut. There it is. It's still there in this picture. So it lasted and was chopped down in 2014 because it got sick. It got destroyed in an ice storm too. But apparently it's a loblolly pine who he actually asked Augusta Country Club to take it down because it got in the way of his drive. And so it became known as the Eisenhower tree. So how's that for some popular culture, right? That's how much he played golf, that he got a tree in Augusta. Anyway, he was kind of accused of kind of like coasting through the presidency. And I think that's a little overstated. I think at times he did take her easy, but at times he's going to, sacrifice some of his popularity. But here's the one where Ike will forever earn the respect of New Dealers. And that is, he is going to lobby and get from Congress the Federal Highway Act. All right. The Federal Highway Act. It's the largest public works project in the history of our country. $27 billion. And see, here's the thing, y'all. Ike had been to Germany, right? And he had seen the Autobahn firsthand. Heck, he drove tanks down it, or rode it. And so he saw how successful that was at connecting Germany to each other, and also for military purpose. So one of the things Eisenhower wanted to do was to link up all of America's military bases. So that's one of the things the interstate does. Okay. Secondly, they're so wide. What can you do? Well, you can certainly drive a tank down on what you need to do for military base. You can land a bomber on them. They're literally made with that in mind, like to as like landing in case bombers have to be nuclear bombers. Plus, the overpasses on the interstate have to be a certain height so that the trucks that carry nuclear missiles can go under them. You understand? So he builds this with what in mind besides transportation? Defense. That's right. Very good. So it's a defense and infrastructure project. And it is the last major time the federal government has passed a serious highway bill. So do you see why Biden's trying to do that? This is what President Biden wants to be his like signature issue, is like the Green Highway Act or the Green Infrastructure Bill. And you know, obviously you're going to debate a $2 trillion bill, right? Because a lot of it ain't going to be highways. But this puts a ton of people to work, right? At a period when people are already working pretty well. It connects our country in a way that never had been connected before. Now, you can imagine, who does it hurt? What industry suffers because of this? Railroads, right? They're going to get a setback. But if you're riding down the interstate, like I-81 or I-85 or 95, you will see a 5-star sign. And it's called the Eisenhower Interstate System. So any of these federal highways with the blue eye were built initially back in the 50s, right? And so big addition. And you can see, look at the number of cars that grew in 15 years, right? 25 million to 60 million. Yeah. And look at how magnificent, I mean, the cars are works of art. I love, right? I love the 50s cars, right? Yeah. They're beautiful. So big change here. Keep in mind that he connects it to both the infrastructure of the nation. So it's like a web to hold our country together, but also militarily. Very much a part of the defense goal that Ike had. Okay? Federal Highway Act. Now, I put some cartoons here, and I think I put them in again later. And Eisenhower is routinely depicted, and I like to remind people of two things. First of all, this cartoonist is one of my all-time favorites. So if you're looking right here, you can see his name, Herbert Block. And so it shortens to Herb Block. And he was a Washington Post cartoonist. And from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, okay, you'll see a ton of these things. And so over here you see McCarthy kind of standing in a dirty pool, right? Like dirt, anything to win. And Eisenhower, squeaky clean. Our differences have nothing to do with the end result that we're seeking. They both what party? They're both Republicans, right? But you know, they're very different in contrast. Okay. Here's Ike wearing a fire chief uniform, right? And he says, "Tisk, tisk, somebody should do something about that." And the fire that's raging out the window says civil rights crisis. So the biggest criticism of Ike is routinely that he kind of flew above the problems of the day and didn't really get down in them. I would argue at times that might be true, but you know, we talked about yesterday Little Rock in '57, right? Yeah. The use of force to deal with integration of public schools was a major risk for President Eisenhower. He would have been a whole lot safer just to what? Yeah. Say, well, you know, it's a state's problem. Let them solve it. And so by him say, keep in mind, a smart leader is never going to get overextended to the point where they fall. Right? They're gonna find the maximum they can reach to, and then that's safe. And that's Ike. He's a middle of the road guy. And so his critics are saying he's not going far enough. It's a prosperous period. A lot of Americans are comfortable. He should rock the boat a little more. Right? That's his criticism. Okay, fair enough. You know, so you should be thinking about that. Now, Ike routinely wanted to balance the budget. You guys understand what that means? The president submits a budget for the federal government, for the executive branch every year to Congress. And Congress passes a budget. Whether or not it's the president depends. So every year he was in office, Ike wanted to balance the budget, but he didn't until 1960. So he will manage in 1960, last year, to get a balanced budget. But he was really embarrassed that every year before that, there were what? Huge budget deficits. And I say huge. Please look at, I know this is not the national debt clock. So you know, oh, this is different. All right, but here's the national debt. I told you we're still paying off World War II's debt, right? Yep. Well, the reason I can say that is that we've never been below this. Never. So it's always been what? Up and up and up. Up and up and up. So if you find the 50s, here's Korea, you will see that we actually have a greater national debt during the Korean War than we did when? World War II. During World War II. And so that, you know, Ike was kind of embarrassed by that. Like, he figured, were we prosperous in the 50s? Yeah, massively prosperous. What should happen to the budget? It should be balanced or even reduced. You know, today we would call it a surplus, or they would call it a surplus then, and that would take the national debt back down to flatline or close to it. But if you'll notice, when did the national debt really take off?
Right after the Vietnam and during
Reagan's presidency. So from Reagan through Obama, Bush to Obama, Trump, it's just done what?
Goes up.
Skyrockets, right? So for most of our history, was the national debt relatively manageable? Not 20th century. Yeah, it's not until Vietnam, until Johnson and Nixon and Ford, and even Johnson kept it barely above where it was. So looking down here, though, I do want you to understand, in the budget, though, what was half of the entire budget? Military spending. So when you have half of the budget, today, over half the budget are two items. Anybody know what two items of the half the budget is? $2 trillion a year.
Military and Social Security.
Not military anymore. It used to be, but it's gone. Military now ranks third and will soon be fourth.
Welfare.
All right. Number one, Social Security.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Number two, Medicare. Healthcare for old people. Number three, the military. Number four, interest on debt. Right. That's the four largest line items. Well, in the Cold War, by a mile, the largest was what? Military spending. You know, half the federal budget was defense spending. So that's an enormous amount of money. And keep in mind, of course, what didn't exist then? Medicare or Medicaid. So two large healthcare programs didn't exist. So he's never going to quite reel in the defense spending like he talks about. He thought he was going to come up with a solution, but he doesn't. And so let's talk about this solution. So major domestic program for Ike, biggest takeaway is the what? The highways. Like the Interstate Highway Act is the biggest by far, right? In terms of domestic policy, you know, in our country. That's what we call policies in the country, domestic, right? At home. So today we're going to focus the rest of the period on his foreign policy, okay? And I want to open you up with a great DBQ prepper, if you want to like study for your DBQ. Tomorrow, DBQ, right? Tomorrow? Yeah. Seems good to me. On what? Truman versus Eisenhower, primarily. Now, I don't want you to think that, keep in mind, all this under Truman should be stuff you're familiar with. Right? The Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine. So I'm not going to tell you that Ike outright rejected that stuff. His Secretary of State was Dean Acheson, the guy who architected containment policy with George Kennan. So know those names, right? But Eisenhower is going to pick as his Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. There is an airport in Washington, D.C. named after him, Dulles Airport, right? And Dulles believed that containment was wrong. It didn't go far enough. Right. What he wants to do is actually, and I didn't even put it on this list, but it's to actually roll back communism. So let that sink in. Under Eisenhower and Dulles, they want to push communism out of countries it's in. And this becomes known as brinksmanship. Brinksmanship means coming to the very brink of what thing? Of nuclear war, right? Yeah, war, but this kind of war would be nuclear in nature. So think of it as like to the brink. It's basically daring the Russians, the Soviets. So they're going to work out further agreements with other national partners. Massive retaliation, we should talk about that now. And again, massive retaliation is the use of nuclear weapons if the Soviets try to make any maneuvers to spread communism. This is not something that Truman had been overtly supportive of. Like, if the Soviets invade or attack some country, what will we do? What is the basic threat of massive retaliation? Drop nukes on them. And these nukes will come from missiles. So if you can think of Truman and nuclear, it's airborne, like planes. Your planes dropping bombs. It's missiles, mostly dropping bombs. He thought missiles would be cheaper until they really started making the big boys. Okay, and then they did like the Atlas missiles, and got crazy. We know what MAD is, right? He continues the domino theory, but what I want you to kind of put a star beside is the use of the CIA. So if you've ever heard about the CIA overthrowing governments and stuff, it's mostly under Eisenhower.
Yep.
And that one of the reasons for that is the head of the CIA is the brother of the Secretary of State. So this is John Foster Dulles. The head of the CIA is his brother, Allen Dulles. And so the Dulles brothers will work, like the CIA will basically become an arm of the State Department. CIA carries out most of its operations out of embassies. Like if you're a CIA operative, you're headquartered in an embassy in that country. That's the State Department. The Eisenhower Doctrine is not only the guarantee of economic support, that was who, but Ike goes further and says we will send who if necessary? American forces. So Truman said we'll send American money. Ike says we'll send American money and Americans to stop the spread of communism. So do you see how we're moving towards sending Americans to fight in communist wars? All right. And he also heavily encourages, Dulles does particularly, dollar diplomacy, the idea of investing in countries so there won't be communism there. You know. So be aware of Dulles. And here's Dulles. The official name for this is the New Look. Okay, so I don't know if I put this up here, but I guess it's another thing I should add. New Look foreign policy. Dulles considered the idea of containment passive, meaning like you're accepting that they're going to exist.
Right.
And therefore, he wants to do what? What's the phrase?
Roll back.
Roll back. So step it up, brinkmanship. Okay? And when it says here reliance on strategic over conventional, that's missiles over like ground troops. Massive retaliation. If you nuke them to death, then they probably won't ever want to do what?
Go head to head.
And lots of covert under the CIA, which I kind of just mentioned. So two different ways to look at New Look foreign policy. Can anybody sense the inherent problem in massive retaliation? All right, so if we use it and they respond with nukes, then we get mad, right? MAD? Okay, that's one reason. Yeah, like the fear of retaliation. Any other reasons why this might be a problem?
Because it's very small country.
All right, what are we going to do? Nuke Vietnam? Right? Because we're going to nuke Hungary when they have a revolt?
There's actually like a
To nuke Vietnam?
not all of Vietnam, but like these tactical.
Oh, yeah. Now, battlefield nukes are developed in the 60s. Tactical nukes. You're right. And the Pakistanis have them today. Kind of a scary thing because you don't want like some NCO having access to a nuclear weapon. Now, these are not like the bombs that blew up Hiroshima. These are battlefield nuclear weapons, which are like much more contained. But yeah, we developed those. It's true. That's not really what I'm looking at. So one of the things I mentioned here, and you need to be aware of this, the Soviet Union, Stalin did not like NATO. NATO was, by the way, Putin can't stand NATO. It's a clear dagger at the heart of Russia, the eastern side of Europe. And so Khrushchev is going to, and I'll show you Nikita Khrushchev in a minute, and the Soviets are going to build an alliance system of their own to respond to Eisenhower. And it's called the Warsaw Pact. Warsaw's in Poland. And these 7 satellites, that's what you would call these countries. These 7, they're not, now remember the Soviet Union is actually made up of 15 countries. Right? The old Russian Empire has 15 republics in it. But the Soviet Union is going to, forcefully, put these 7 countries in an alliance with them. So just like with NATO, under an alliance, if one member is attacked, what is that considered? Attack on all of them. That's right. And so what this means is if there's a revolt in any of these countries, right, the Soviets view it as an attack if we help them, right? Because this is their zone, their sphere, their buffer. And Stalin and Khrushchev are not going to allow America to turn these countries from being communist. And that the perfect test of this is 56. 56 is the first time a Soviet bloc, i.e. Warsaw Pact country, tries to throw off communism. This is called the Hungarian Uprising. And this fellow is much more open to having free elections, far more than the Soviets are willing to accept. Because obviously if Hungary has elections, then what's going to get elected is not communists. People don't like communism. So the Soviets send in armed forces into Hungary to prevent this election. They occupied Budapest, for example. America is outraged. You know, oh my gosh, Marlon Brando, it runs like a fundraiser for the Hungarian people. What do we do in response? Nothing, right? And so this shows you the inadequacy of massive retaliation, because we're not going to nuke Hungary, right? And we're not going to nuke Soviet Union over Hungary. Why? This is World War III, and we don't want to fight World War III over Hungary. This isn't Poland in World War II, apparently. Like, this will not be that. So we're not going to defend Soviet, like Warsaw Pact countries from having their rebellions crushed. And so you're going to see throughout the Cold War, the Czechs are going to rebel, Prague Spring they call it. The Poles are going to rebel, but we don't do anything because the Soviet Union crushes them, and we don't want to start World War III. So a lot of people in the Eastern Europe bloc will say, gee, Eisenhower was full of nothing. Yeah, like empty promises kind of thing. Dulles didn't follow through on what he said. We're not going to help these countries roll back, in other words. Now, I told you there was a new leader of the Soviet Union, and this is him. So this is Nikita Khrushchev, and you should know this guy. Khrushchev had been the apparatchik, the party leader of Stalingrad, and he was Stalin's sort of chief lieutenant. He was a burly old coal miner. He was bald, and he looked like just a tough brute kind of guy. And he very famously came to the United Nations in '56 and pounded on the podium, and at the end of his speech said, whether you like it or not, history is on our side, we will bury you. Right, so there's only going to be kissing and making up with Khrushchev. Now, Khrushchev immediately did what was called de-Stalinization, which is like cut back on the gulags and the great purges. But he is going to continue to use force and authoritarian governments in Eastern Europe. So if you can think of it this way, FDR and Truman had Stalin as their kind of rival. Eisenhower and Kennedy have Khrushchev. So you do need to know their sort of Soviet counterpart during all of their conflict, okay? So this is the new leader of the Soviet Union. And while he's, I guess you could say, nicer than Stalin, he's by no means nice. Stalin's a mass murderer, 20 million people. It's this moment, though, that really will change the future of our country and this little country, too. So this is Indochina, as it was called, this area. Indochina had been a French colony since the 1880s, right? The French had come over, French missionaries had been there in the 1850s, I think, like way back. And they used Indochina primarily for rubber. At that time in history, rubber was not synthetic. Today, Goodyear makes rubber not from the tree, but from the vulcanization process. This was actually trees. So they had a lot of rubber plantations that were French-owned in Indochina. And today, Indochina is 4 countries, well, 3 today. Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And Vietnam is the one closest to what's called the Gulf of Tonkin. So if you see this island that says Hainan, that's part of China, their territory. So this right above Hainan is China, and that's Vietnam today. So at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, a young man was a waiter from Indochina and traveled all the way to Paris to try to talk to Woodrow Wilson. So I want you to imagine like a 20-year-old trying to get a hold of Woodrow Wilson. Wilson didn't even see him, but he was from Indochina. And he wanted to get Wilson to guarantee the independence of Indochina after World War I. Well, who owned Indochina, quote unquote? Who was their master?
French.
The French, who was our ally. The French, therefore, none of that. So after World War I, the Japanese are going to move in and occupy North Vietnam during the Vietnam War, driving out the French. So after World War II, what do you think the Indochinese, quote, Vietnamese people want? To not have the French there. But the French came back. The French said, okay, we're back. This is our country. And that is going to create a violent rebellion against the French. Starting in 1950, running through 51, 52, you can see here, over here, the dark areas. Most of the fighting takes place around the city of Saigon in the south. Here's Saigon, which is the capital of South Vietnam. And up here in the north, in the highlands of northern, where it says Tonkin. See that? And in 1950, okay, so here's some background. The French came back and the Indo-Chinese fought, right? Except by this point, they've adopted this guy as their leader, and his name is Ho Chi Minh. And since Ho Chi Minh didn't get support from America after World War I, guess who he went and looked for support from? The Soviet Union. And were they willing to give it to him? Yes. And guess who was willing to give it to him after World War II? Who fought against the Japanese? China. And who became in 1948, 49 communists? Excuse me. China. So the Chinese and the Soviets are now fully helping this group that are called the Viet Minh, led by who? And in 1954, stunning the world, this tiny little third world country, right? Tiny little third world country defeated the French. It's one of the most strategic defeats in history. It's called the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Now you see this pass in the mountains? Dien Bien Phu is a fort down in a valley. And they were well defended, but what the Viet Minh did was they actually climbed mountains with artillery cannons strapped to their back. Yeah, no, it's the French, right? What are they doing? But they controlled the pass through here, right? It was like you couldn't get stuff through it without going by the fort. But and they thought that the kind of cliffs were too hard to be climbed.
Obviously, they were wrong.
Right. Well, these Viet Minh, later the Viet Cong, climbed these things and start shelling the French inside their fort, and the French have to leave. Now, when this was going on during President Truman's presidency, remember, what did the Truman Doctrine do? Well, we gave money to guess who? The French, because they're fighting communism, right? Now, I want to really emphasize something, guys. This guy was a communist. There's no doubt about it. But when you went around and asked the Vietnamese people, they didn't understand communism, democracy, capitalism, none of that stuff. They just didn't want foreigners running their country. So what do we call that ism? Nationalism. And this is going to be the problem of all the post-war world, is that every time a former colony gets its independence, be it Ghana or Kenya, we're going to ask, are they communist or not, right? And so if we didn't help them, and why would we probably not have helped them? Who were their imperial masters? The British and the French, right? Who are our allies, right? So we're not going to help some third world people overthrow the British and the French. In fact, we're going to help the French try to stop them from overthrowing under Truman. Well, now you got Eisenhower. But look at what Eisenhower says. No thanks. I don't want to touch this thing, right? Have we already fought one war in Southeast Asia, or in East Asia? Not Southeast Asia. Yeah, we don't want another Korea. So France leaves, and Vietnam is divided temporarily. So just like Korea, Vietnam will be divided. Only this time it'll be divided on the 17th parallel. So if you ever want to do a mental comparison to these two countries, Korea, mountainous and cold, right? Korea is like Canada line of latitude. Vietnam, tropical rainforest, jungle, really different places. 38th parallel way up, 17th much lower, right? Tropics. So Vietnam is divided. President at the time, Ho Chi Minh of North Vietnam, right? And in the South, the French and America backed a Catholic pro-Western guy named Diem. Diem, right? This guy was pro-Western. The problem is he wasn't pro-Vietnamese. He was way more pro-Diem. You understand? This guy's a crook, basically. But he's a pro-us crook. So guess what? We support him. Now, we decide, not we, but the world, at a conference in Geneva, by Geneva, always a neutral country, right? That there'll be 2 years later elections. Okay, so in 56, we're going to have elections in Vietnam. By the way, Laos and Cambodia were broken away already. They got independence without having to do all this. Okay? But Vietnam was a divided country. Now, Diem was so unpopular. By the way, one of the things Diem did was he was taking land from Buddhist monasteries around Vietnam, lots of those, and distributing them to his cronies. So just think about like cronyism, that kind of behavior. His policies were so bad, you actually had some stuff like this. Now, guys, you can see this video online. I'm not going to play it for you right now because it's really awful. But this is a Buddhist monk. Now, if you know anything about peaceful people, the most peaceful people on the planet are Buddhist monks, right? These are the guys that are in the orange robes and they're bald and they meditate, right? That's all they do. Well, their monasteries are being occupied and they're being forced out, basically. And so this guy walked into one of the main thoroughfares of Saigon. He had a friend with him. The friend douses him with gasoline. The guy sits there in prayer, and he's lit on fire. And the guy never says a word. He just sits there. This is called self-immolation, burning yourself to death as a form of protest. I know some of you guys are writing about civil disobedience or something like that. This is the extraordinary version.
Yeah, you gave your life to
Yeah,
disobedience. That's pretty bad.
he literally gave his life as a protest, like overtly, you know. And if you got people setting themselves on fire in protest to you, and not just any people, but Buddhist monks, then you probably are pretty bad.
Yeah.
We're going to later, the CIA is going to let this guy get assassinated under President Kennedy because he's so terrible. Okay, but this was a mistake, because here's the thing: if you're Vietnamese, guess which one of these you'd much rather have?
Probably
Ho Chi Minh by a mile, right? You know, so the communists in the north are going to win. But guess what? They don't have the elections. When it becomes, there's VM meeting with Dulles and Eisenhower. We went ahead and supported him because we believed that he was Democratic. Later on, we discovered it. So we didn't know all this stuff. Keep in mind, what did McCarthy get rid of? A lot of the guys who worked in the State Department, right? Who studied all this stuff and were experts on it. So not just there, but other places too. And the last thing you want to get rid of are people who know about this part of the world, right? So nonetheless, we're going to back ZM because he's pro-democracy, anti-communist. At least he says he is. And so in 56, when the election doesn't happen, what's going to start? The Vietnam War. Now, we're not going to be in it in 56, but unfortunately, by 60, guess what we've done? Almost 1,000 advisors, but not nearly as many as Kennedy. Kennedy's going to send 13,000. So the focus primarily by Ike is what? It's aid, i.e., like money and guns to the South Vietnamese, right? And then these guys are sent to explain how to use those, like to teach them how to fly a helicopter, teach them how to shoot machine guns, things like that. But look at, this is what DM did. He was an absolute corrupt scumbag. Okay? So you're like, well, gee, you think the Vietnamese would prefer this guy or Ho Chi Minh? It was like a guy living in a cave with their people and poor. He lived like a impoverished peasant. This guy's one of us. This guy's a scumbag. So we backed the wrong horse. We should have got Ho to be a what? A capitalist. We need Vietnamese buying Levi's and smoking Marlboros. We don't want to be killing them, right? So this is where we made a mistake, I think, early on. And I think Ho Chi Minh kept things like the Declaration of Independence. Had we actually talked with these people, we would pretty much figure out, hey, he'll switch to democracy. But
yeah, because he was a Democrat. He was for democracy before he read the Communist Manifesto.
What is Ho Chi Minh really all about, guys? Is self-government for the Vietnamese people. Now, I'm not going to say he didn't do some bad stuff. Under him, there were people tortured and oppressed, right? Obviously, American POWs had terrible treatment, right? But by the time a war with America breaks out, this guy's too old. He's not even running the country anymore. Okay, so we kind of missed our window to have Ho be on our side. But anyway, that's us in Vietnam. So, and of course, under President Kennedy, President Johnson, and President Nixon, Vietnam's going to become far worse. Okay, it's going to become our problem. Got that? We'll look at Vietnam later. Now, we're also going to get involved in the Middle East. And man, this one has really come back to haunt us. Today, the CIA has a word for screwing up stuff in the past that makes you pay for it later. It's called blowback, right? Like where you do something, you think it's good at the time, and later on, you're like, oops, that was our bad. Well, Operation Ajax is one of those things, all right? Because Iran had a fairly moderate, developed country after World War II, right? This is Mohammad Mossadegh, all right? And he was the elected president of Iran. Now, Iran at the time was not run by religious fanatics. Right. It was run by sort of a middle-class, moderate leftist. I will say that, leftist. And so what Mossadegh does is he's unhappy at the company that we now call BP, British Petroleum. The Arab British oil petroleum company was extracting oil from Iran, right? And the Iranians weren't getting the real benefit from it. They were just, like, in other words, like down the road where the BP oil wells and the money was going to British.
Yeah, it's
right.
on their land. well as ours.
Right. And of course, the gas was cheap during this period. Up
Wonder.
there. So Masada pulls one of the classic leftist moves of everyone at this period in history. So if you want to be called a communist, nationalize a foreign business. So what that means is BP is located, these oil wells in Iran, right? So what Masada said is that you're out of Iran and those will now be Iranian-owned oil wells. This is called nationalizing, when the country where a foreign business is located takes over the business from the foreign company. So he nationalizes the oil of his country. And the CIA is like, no way, this guy's way too leftist. He's kind of like a what almost. Yeah, if you're nationalizing and socializing oil, which is one of our great dependencies, he's got to go. So we plot Operation Ajax. That's the name of it. Then the CIA helps overthrow this guy and plants this guy as the king of Iran. So the word Shah, S-H-A-H, I should put that on there. The Shah becomes the king of Iran. Shah is Persian for emperor.
That's
Not yet. Don't get too far ahead, but it will. What happens is, under him, he is just like I was talking about here. Pro-Western, so the oil flows, right? All the oil flows to BP and American Exxon, stuff like that. He's brutally oppressive. He's way too Western, which means he's modern, right? And so this is who Iranians will associate with America. This brutal, oppressive dude. And in the 1970s, he's going to be in the United States getting surgery, and he will be overthrown. His government will be overthrown with the Iranian Revolution in '79. And that's the Iranians that we live with today, one of our most dangerous enemies, right? So this is blowback. The current world we live in, anger by Iran, goes back to this. Well, China isn't we are overt enemies of Iran. We've actually shot at them on the water. We've had battles. The Chinese are adversaries, they're not our enemy. Iran is the leading country that sponsors terrorism in the Middle East. So in Syria is a puppet for Iran. Iraq has become a puppet for Iran. And if the Israelis weren't blowing up their nuclear facilities every couple of years, they would be a nuclear power. So we need to get Iran back in the box, so to speak. But this is where they went off the rails. And so blowback from this is that today the Iranian people, guys, before 1979, Iran was still a secular Western country.
right.
But the extremists were able to use this guy as a reason for the revolution. So I would rather have a moderate socialist any day than an absolute monarch who leads to the most brutal regime, one of the most brutal regimes in history. The Ayatollahs of Iran have overseen some absolute brutal oppression. So I'd rather go back to this guy. But he was a decent dude all in all. But anyway, Masada, know him. Let's move on. Let's see what time is it, 2:40. All right. Speaking of nationalizing stuff, this charming fella is Jamal Abdel Nasser. And he is one of the most successful Arabs in modern history. He wants to create an Arab republic. Now you think about that. There hasn't been a unified Arab world since the Middle Ages, right? And he wants to create a giant United Arab Republic, okay? And so he actually takes over Syria during this period. He tries to take over Lebanon, but he is the president of Egypt for the better part of 15 years. And one of the things that Nasser, and you can tell by the way he's dressed, he's Western. He's not a religious fundamentalist. And he is one of those non-aligned countries who actually is trading with the Soviet Union. So he's got MiG jets, he's got tons of AK-47s, Russian weaponry, but he's not a communist. He's just trading with them. And so what he wants to do is to get Egypt to be more powerful, but they need money. So he looks around Egypt, he's like, all right, tourism ain't making that much money in the 50s over here, right? What can make a lot of money? Well, we know that it makes billions of dollars a day now because it got blocked a couple weeks ago. Right? Yeah, so this is the Suez Canal. Actually, this isn't the Suez Canal, this is the Aswan High Dam. He wants to build a dam on the Nile River to have electricity control the flooding, the seasonal flood, so it's less destructive, have nutrients for the soil. You know, he wants a whole economic program based on this dam. But well, it was, and it's worked. Egypt is much more successful because of it. But to do that, he takes over the Suez Canal. Now, the Brits owned the Suez Canal by their argument. You know, the Brits and the French built it. And by this point, the Egyptians are a very strong country. And so one of the most amazing things happens. Now, Israel, of course, views Egypt as its existential threat. Here's Israel, right here. You see the Negev, the desert. So here's the Sinai Peninsula, right? And Egypt is, you know, here's the canal. And so British, French, and Israeli forces, British, French, and Israeli, are going to attack Egypt. So what does Eisenhower do about it?
Nothing.
Why?
He doesn't want to get involved.
Yeah, but he has to get involved, right?
Can't really just attack Mark.
You're not going to attack Britain. You don't want to attack Egypt. Why? All right, guys, Egypt is a friend with Russia, right? And so they're not officially allied, but we think if we attack Egypt, he'll get mad.
The USSR.
The Soviets. But more importantly, Ike was not consulted at all by the British, the French, or the Israelis. They didn't tell Ike they were going to attack him.
That's right.
And so that means for Ike, who might have just started World War III?
Israel.
Right. Israel, Britain, and France, without telling us. So he is furious about this, right? And so he says, okay, Britain and France and Israel, we're going to embargo you guys. So the United States embargoes oil. He's like, all right, we're not going to give y'all any oil until this thing is over with.
Let backfire.
It didn't at the time because guess who backs down? It's the only war Israel loses during the whole period. The Brits and the French and the Israelis lose. They decided to stop fighting. So who takes over the Suez Canal? Egypt. This will be the last time in history America has used oil as a weapon. During the 50s, we were still a net oil what on a large scale?
Producer.
Well, not only producer, but exporter.
Now we're an importer.
Well, but that's actually this past year we're an exporter again.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because all the shale, you know, all the fracking we're doing. I know, right? But when I say use it as a weapon, who can't go without oil in this narrative? The Brits and the French military. Right? The British and the French can't go without oil, so they have to agree to stop fighting. So the Egyptians take over and now run the Suez Canal. And you know, he kind of flexes on this. He's like, you guys aren't going to consult with me, and we didn't settle it diplomatically, so good luck. You got nothing. So you said he doesn't do anything. Kinda he doesn't do anything, but he doesn't let America sell oil to them. So that's doing something. You know? So Nasser's a big hero in this, but you see he dies sort of unexpectedly in 1970. He would have been around probably a lot longer. Speaking of Middle East, we've got the Eisenhower Doctrine, right?
Yep.
So this is the only real country that we're going to utilize the Eisenhower Doctrine. Not the CIA, mind you. The CIA did Iran, but that wasn't American forces. But in 1958, now remember, what did this guy want to create? One giant Arab state, right?
Yep.
And so one of the countries he was trying to take over was Lebanon. Lebanon, which is a very small country, you know, below Syria. So President Eisenhower actually sent U.S. forces, there's the U.S. Army, to Beirut, and to prop up a pro-Western government to make sure that Syria and Egypt, which was one leader, Nasser, didn't take over Lebanon, right? Today, Lebanon is a proxy state by and large for Syria. Syria pretty much has occupied Lebanon. And the last time we seriously tried to stop them from doing that was in the 80s under President Reagan. And the U.S. Marines were blown all to smithereens there. We had hundreds of Marines killed in a Beirut bombing, a terrorist attack. And we withdrew. We haven't been back to Lebanon. You know, so today Lebanon is really kind of kept in check, you know, by the Israelis. You know, but when you talk about Lebanon, you talk about Syria. Today they're both proxy states by and large for Iran. Iran determines, and Russia now. Russia's in Syria, so you know it's a mess. So one of the things that all this conflict produced was a problem for the leader of Saudi Arabia, and he decided that the best way to fix all this was to form a cartel. Okay. That's right. And so he got together and they formed the greatest cartel maybe in all of history, bigger than any drug cartel or anything like that. They created the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. And OPEC will have absolute ability to influence the daily lives of the American people.
Oh.
Because if OPEC decides not to let oil flow, then every one of our lives are disrupted. So this is the moment I believe America truly lost its independence. You know, and it's since then that I wanted to be, since studying this, that I wanted us to be off fossil fuels. Not only for its environmental damage and destruction, but because we're dependent on Middle East butchers and dictators for our economic survival.
Yeah, that's
It's not good. Not good at all. And we can drill as much as we can, but we'll never be able to make up for what OPEC does. You know, it's just not enough.
unless a bunch of companies break up from it, which they won't.
Well, the beauty of this is that they get to set a monopoly price. I mean, why wouldn't you? Well, I mean,
That's true too. Why are gas prices so high now?
Well, actually, you know, the prices are going to be affected for a variety of reasons. You know, even the blockage of the Suez Canal.
Yeah.
Flows in
Yeah,
there.
that really boosted it.
But OPEC is going to have a lot of impact on us in the 70s. When we get to the OPEC in the 70s is going to embargo the United States. And you're going to have literally people who can't get gasoline anymore. Gas lines. Like, it's going to be terrible. And I lived through it. I remember waiting on Saturdays, which was our day to get gas, for hours in lines to get gas.
That's pretty bad.
Yeah. I mean, that was in America in the 70s. So that'll wreck Jimmy Carter. That's OPEC. So in the midst of President Eisenhower's presidency, we have a re-election, okay? And you look at how comfortable he does, right? Solid South, Adlai Stevenson round 2. It really isn't, you know, I still like Ike. I don't even need to get into this campaign. You can read about 56 if you want. The major criticism of him, again, is that he kind of what?
Just sits there and does nothing but so.
Yeah, he's like on autopilot, you know, like chilling. But I would argue that's inaccurate, you know. Keep in mind, Eisenhower is a Republican, but in the sense of like not being an active governor or president, a commander, he reminds me of like Thomas Jefferson days, where the presidency, see, today we kind of look to the president to solve everything. And that's not what you're supposed to, Congress is really supposed to solve a lot more stuff than the president.
Yeah.
Right? And this president tried to do that. He tried to work with Congress, and he did. There was some bipartisanship, believe it or not, in Congress. But by and large, you know, he used his executive authority when he had to, he saw. Now, remember I told you guys the other day that labor unions peaked by 54? You had several acts like Taft-Hartley that had really slowed down the growth of labor unions. Well, it's by the 50s, when life was so well, that labor unions screwed up.
The Teamsters.
But not just the Teamsters. Unfortunately, unions, because they had been around for 60 and 70 years, some of their leaders had well, look at it this way. If you've got a union with 1,000 members and they pay $25 a month in dues, right? That's $250,000 pretty quickly. And that's $250,000 in cash. So guess who likes to have their money laundered? The mob. So a good way to money launder is to just move it through the union. Call it dues, right? Good way to get money is to have the union say, we're not going to do business with you, so to speak, like drive trucks, dumpsters, whatever, unless you pay X or Y. So unfortunately, and this is really the thing that unions today are often associated with in the minds of the American public, is the mob and gangsters start working with the union, start controlling the unions, the big unions, okay? It's just too much money. And so you have a law passed after this fella, I think it's after he disappears or right around the time he disappeared. This is Jimmy Hoffa, and he was the leader of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, which is the guys that drive trucks and handle unloading and loading trucks. So like big, burly type dudes, you know, like truckmen. And there's a couple really good movies about the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa. One of them has just recently Robert De Niro as the Irishman killing Jimmy Hoffa, who's played by Al Pacino. So it's a good movie if you guys on Netflix want to watch. It's a movie that was made for Netflix by Martin Scorsese, that great Italian filmmaker. But Jimmy Hoffa was involved with gangsters, right? Very much so, particularly in places like New Jersey and New York. And one day he disappeared, like he just vanished off the face of the earth, and he's never been found. And so a couple people have claimed to have murdered him later in life, right? But he was a part of a group of people who were using labor unions, the bosses of the unions, so to speak, were using the money to get crooked stuff done, right? And that led Congress to pass a law saying you can't do that anymore. All right, meaning we're going to investigate. So this says U.S. labor regulating labor unions' internal affairs. That means who the secretary and presidents are. All this stuff has to be disclosed, tax information. So it's like transparency in labor. This is also the period when unions start to go down, right? Because of other factors too, not because of just organized crime, but that's the peak of it. And today, most Americans who are sort of opposed to unions, this is what's in their memory, in their recent memory, is mobsters and gangsters. They would use intimidation and force, among others. All right, now, again, I think that's painting a too broad brushstroke with unions and plural, but certainly it did happen, and it was a real problem. Speaking of real problems, how about the Russians? So in 1957, Americans are going to open the newspaper to discover that there is a fairly large metal ball flying over us. All right, and it was put up there by the Russians. It's an artificial satellite, right? So today we're totally used to the concept of satellites, but at the time this was so scary because we thought we were the best. What's the year?
57.
And so we're making 57 Chevys, right? We're making awesome Zenith TVs and stuff.
Yep, and then some people on Sputnik and all that goes up.
And that's exactly right. Like Americans do like a gut check. They're like, oh my gosh, we have been spending all our time and effort on recreation and entertainment. It's some news, but in reality, the Soviets are ahead of us, in something. And that really scared Americans, particularly because if they could use these satellites and they could theoretically spy on America from these satellites, or they could put a bomb or set of bombs on them, right? And they could put many of them up there. And you could actually see Sputnik with the naked eye at night. Like it was fairly low orbit, okay? And it ultimately crashed. Like, it's one of those orbits that concentrically get smaller. So nonetheless, Americans were stunned. And he was bothered by this. Everybody was bothered by this. So you see a lot of space movies in the 50s about aliens, right? And so outer space stuff, UFOs, and usually the association is the aliens were a metaphor for communists, right? And the communists are beating us into space. So this creates the space race, we call it. So I'll finish up with Ike, and we won't do the DBQ tomorrow. I'll finish up on Wednesday or Thursday.